The teachers I've worked with this year, and there are many hundred of them sort of doing different training events like this, that for many teachers this is the elephant in their room. And if you're 38 or older, and you can see quite clearly I'm considerably older than 38, you will have tutored, or at least you may have tutored students in the past for an individual study, which I shall continue to call, because I can't get my head around NEA. I don't see the acronym, non-examined assessment, doesn't really make sense to anybody, so I'm going to call it the individual study. But if you're 38 or younger, you haven't had that, but you've probably had it done to you at some stage. You've probably had it done to you, perhaps if you're in your 30s, perhaps you did an individual investigation as a student at school, or most people would do one as an undergraduate at university. So I think things are different. I think there was a point when I thought, well, it's a bit like sometimes they say, you know, if you stand around in one place for long enough in education, the pendulum will come back to greet you. You know, and that does happen certainly sometimes. But I think things are different, because I think certainly when the last individual studies were assessed to A level in 2001, there were league tables and there were pressures to perform, but not like they are now. There weren't things like progress measures in place. And I think the word independent study means things for teachers as well as it does for students. And I think it perhaps means a style of teaching, and I'm going to probably refer to it several times this afternoon as tutoring, which I think is very different. And I think 20 years ago, those of you who were in the education system in any form 20 years ago, it was quite often normal to think of as a teacher, as somebody who would tutor you. Now we've replaced it with terms like coaching. And I think you'll see some of the things that I'm going to talk about this afternoon are about coaching. So if you're teaching in Wales, then that's the extract from the Welsh specification, but actually it's common ground for all English and Welsh specifications. But if you look at different specifications like AQA, OCR, Edexcel, you'll see that the number of marks out of which the study is marked varies. It's 60 for some boards, 70 or 80 for others. But Ofqual have insisted in both England and Wales that the features are the same, that it's worth 20% of the A level, and that it should represent 35 hours of teaching time, and as well 4 fieldwork days. And again, your head teachers will have to sign something, as they will have to at GCSE, to say that the opportunity is being given to all your students to get those fieldwork days. Now, you might be very crafty, and I hope you win, because I met a teacher a month or so ago who weighed the specification for AS at her head teacher and said, we need 2 days for AS and we need 4 days for A level. The head misunderstood, and she's got 6 days fieldwork. And she was cheering about that and thinking that was really great. But they must have 4, certainly. And that's split, because in Wales you've kept the AS qualification, that's split 2 days at AS. And the reason it's split at 2 at AS is because fieldwork is assessed in the AS examinations, as I'll show you in a moment. So, in a sense, you've got to play kind of, I don't know what to call it really, good cop, bad cop, I don't quite know how to express this really, but you've got to have fieldwork which meets the requirements of the AS examinations. So in a sense, that's a bit like having the GCSE fieldwork in a way. You know, there's certain things you have to do. But then you're going to be turning around, as we talked this morning, and saying to students, and now you can do what you like. But I think that may vary depending on how you organise your first fieldwork, and we'll look at a number of ways of organising that. Final thing I want to say, I perhaps didn't make this point clearly enough to London teachers yesterday. It is designed to be something that you do in class as well as at home, and it's not controlled assessment. It is very much, you might be saying to students at some stage, right, we're having a fieldwork week next week, and they go to all their geography lessons, whether you've got 4 hours, 5 hours of geography teaching, when they'll work on their fieldwork in lesson time, and you'll monitor it and the way it's going. And I'll talk about specific things you might do in that time later. But 35 hours, that's out of a total of 300 that were allocated for the A-levels. Each A-level subject is intended to be 240 hours taught time, and that's over 60 weeks, 36 weeks in year 1 and 24 weeks in year 2. 24 weeks in year 2 will take you up to Easter, finishing for Easter. And you would have at least a minimum of 4 hours a week. Is there anybody who teaches less than 4 hours a week to sixth form? As long as you're getting that, that's fine. Some of you may get 5. Does anybody get 5? That has been a norm up until now, but I suspect that time pressure on sixth forms is increasing and probably not going to get any better. But some of that time as well, there's 60 hours. To make it up to the 300 hours for an A-level course, it's 240 teaching hours plus 60 hours private study. Now, actually, I think the students are going to be doing a lot more than 60. Well, you might wish that some of them would do 60 hours. Some of you might wish you would do 6 hours private study. But there's 60 hours private study time built in. So some of that time is private study. And remember, the individual investigation or study can be done at home. It's not like controlled assessment. So they can be doing parts of it. If you think data presentation by the stage of the age at which they're at is not something they particularly need your guidance on, or need less guidance, compared, say, to analysis or teaching them particular techniques like Spearman's rank or chi-square, etc. You may feel they might want more of your time at that stage rather than, say, data presentation stage. So plan it out, but do, when you're doing your 2-year plan, include some time for teaching, depending on when you do the field work. And the individual study is predicated on 2 days field work at AS, 1 day of which must be in physical and 1 day human geography to cover the different themes in the course. And it can be local or further afield on full or part days, and it must be done beyond the school grounds. And that's one of the things that head teachers, again, will be signing for at AS. They'll have to sign that statement. And the inquiry processes that I showed you this morning, the 6 stages of inquiry, they look slightly different because those what they look like at A level, but it's much the same. When you look at the stages, you'll see that with fieldwork this morning and the stages of inquiry, we were looking at 6 stages. Here there are 7. They're only slightly different, but certainly a lot fuller at this stage. And I think it helps to spell it out. I actually wonder whether a little bit of this spelling out for GCSE, all GCSE specifications, might not be a bad idea here. You get a good idea in terms of what preparation means. And notice it says background reading. And whereas you may not be having to do that for AS quite so much, for A level, I think that's going to be really useful. And I think for students suddenly to be told by a teacher, you know, you can do what you like and think up a title now, that's not going to happen. I think it needs to be as organic a process as possible. And I think students will develop a little bit like that cycle of inquiry that I had on the screen this morning, the 6 stages, if you like, turned into a cycle. And that our ideas really arise from what we've done and what we know already. So I think, you know, it's not going to happen on day 1 of the AS course, for instance. Having some aims and objectives, planning field research and secondary sources, data sampling techniques, health and safety procedures. The planning stage is going to be quite a big thing. And it's going to be quite different from walking in, say, to a year 10 or a year 11 and a single day's GCSE field trip. There's going to have to be more work done to prepare for that. This fairly self-explanatory collection of primary data, but bear in mind collection of primary data must include data sampling strategies at AS. So whereas you might deal with sampling methods at GCSE in a fairly cursory way, students do need to know the difference between random, stratified and systematic sampling. And I think sometimes we should also admit, they're not always in the specification, opportunistic sampling as well, which in my experience tends to be mainly what you do at GCSE. Because if you are if you're in Brecon on a day doing studies of tourism or Tenby, often on a wet day in March, you tend not to be able to do this in the middle of summer. On a wet day in March, you might get 4 or 5 people and that's it. And they're all getting, you know, surrounded by these 15, 16-year-olds asking them questions. There's no system at all in that. That's just whoever happens to be there. So there's opportunistic sampling as well. And I think students need to admit to that, and that's fine if they do. Processing, presenting data, that's fairly straightforward. Again, analysing data, but including, and this is the pressure for AS, certain statistical techniques. The presence of that AS examination means that there are certain stats techniques in the spec that you will have to teach, because within these stages form the basis for examiners to set you questions at AS. And then drawing conclusions, much the same as we were discussing this morning, reviewing success. But, and I think this is a big but, it's not only useful for the AS, this is particularly useful for your individual investigations, considering how the inquiry could be further developed. And for some students, if they're doing something on rebranding in Cardiff or regeneration or place images, place representation, some of them might think, no, I like hard data, I want to do something that's quite systematic and physical in nature. We talk about hard data sometimes, times when you get your wellies on in geography. But other students might really like the human approach, the qualitative approaches, what we sometimes, I think, wrongly, but anyway, we refer to it as soft data evidence. Then I think some of your students really might want to think where they could go, and you might spend quite a bit of time thinking about where the study might go as part of the preparation for students. Now, the inquiry and geographical skills are all listed. I'm not going to go through any of them other than simply put those, that's the representation of what's in the specification, but they are spelled out in more detail to you. The inquiry skills are essentially, that's the process of carrying out fieldwork inquiry, there's that, but there's also a list of suitable primary, secondary resources that are spelled out in the spec, together with core skills, cartographic skills, graphical, statistical and ICT skills that you might use in terms of whether it's involved in data collection, recording or in analysis. So look at those carefully, and I would also look at the sample assessment materials to get a sense of how those skills might be used. There'll be two basic mechanisms for assessing fieldwork at AS, and I'm sorry if the font size is so small here, it's hard for you to see, but I had to put these two really side by side. Examiners have really got two strategies for assessing fieldwork. One is to assess fieldwork that students have done, and they refer to that as familiar fieldwork. And then there are questions about unfamiliar fieldwork. And thinking about what Margaret's just been talking about data, your students have really, I think, got to get used to coming across hard data like this map, for instance. It's a choropleth map. Apologies again if it's very small. A choropleth map showing urban land use in a UK town in 1967. Again, there's quite a bit of reading with these unfamiliar fieldwork questions, because you have to contextualise it for the students doing the exam. An A-level geography student decided to survey current land uses in a small town. She consulted the results of a study from around 50 years ago, shown in figure 3, that's this, as the starting point. And the first thing she was asked to do was a skills question. And you'll be familiar, I'm sure, by now with the new assessment objectives. That's AO3. Skills just describing the distribution of industrial areas in figure 3, so she'd focus on that. And then she would focus on discuss possible ways of improving and updating the classification system used in 67 before carrying out a new survey. That's a tough call. That's a really tough call. And so the keys here, apologies again if it's very small, shopping, public buildings, commercial, industry, residential, open spaces. And I think the implication of that kind of question is that when we are collecting data, categorisation and classification has to be part of our planning for students about how they're going to record data. And I think just to give them, say, a data recording sheet and say, right, off you go, here's an old GODE map, now go and fill in, that's what was there, here, I've given you a blank version, here's what you should record now, what is there. It's going to be hard unless students have really thought about, well, what are the categories, what does the key mean, what are the possibilities? So I think whether or not you give students a categorisation like that in the field, having given them something to think up and come up with ideas for categorisation first, and then you say, well, look, you've thought about it, but here's the one we're going to use. I think they've got to go through that process, because that's the tough assessment objective. That's AO2, which is application. And that's where You know, if you are going through, as Margaret introduced at the beginning of the afternoon, Bloom's taxonomy, it's that ability to apply, interpret, analyse, assess, evaluate. Those are the high-level skills that students have to go through. Because actually, once they do it, they might think, well, okay, we've got shopping here. Doesn't tell you whether it's comparison shops or convenience shops, doesn't tell you what sort, doesn't tell you if it's major stores or chain stores, that kind of thing. Once students get into thinking what it's about, it's actually not a hard question to pick up the marks on. But I think the barrier may be in the question if they haven't done that preliminary thinking. And then outline one other possible method of analysing how land use varied between different parts of the town, other than by maps. Yeah, thinking questions, aren't they? But only for 3 marks. One other possibility. How are your thinking heads on a Friday afternoon? Can you get your heads around that one? It's a tough one, isn't it? One other possible method of analysing how land use varied between different parts of the town, other than by maps. Sorry. Photos, yeah. Analysing photos, etc. Yeah. Transects of building height or something like that, and little sketch diagrams to show industry and so on. Yeah. It's just, they're not the kinds of questions students have been used to. And I think when you look at the wording of Assessment Objective 2, I think that's where a lot of teaching is going to have to be done in the next year or so. Well, next few months, let's be blunt. Then you get familiar fieldwork, and you may feel a bit more able to relax on this, except that again, this is a good one actually, I think, to put in a sample assessment question, because sample assessments often are intended to set the tone for a refocus if there is a change in the specification. And this one, discuss the importance of teamwork for carrying out your fieldwork investigation in human geography. So, well, it was nice. We managed to collate all our data in Costa and et cetera, But really, again, the students got to think, to access the higher levels, they've got to think structurally about the investigation. So it enabled a larger data sample, et cetera, which gave us a larger sample, but which gave our correlation greater significance. Using words from the spec like that is going to be where the high level answers. And then this one, describe and justify the choice of case study used for your fieldwork investigation in physical geography. Describe and justify. Well, the teacher told us that's where we were going. But you see what I mean? Like the GCSE, they're going to have to think through the nature of the environment in which they're doing this. Now, if you're Educas England, you don't have to worry about this. And I think, if you're not, well, if you're doing AS, I would use the sample assessment materials with your students anyway, not just to prepare them for AS, but to think about what needs to go into this individual investigation. What's going to be different about this from the sort of field work that we've done before at GCSE? Okay, onwards to basics. 20% you know already about the value of this, the A level, then progressing to A level from AS. Between 3,000 and 4,000 words, Ofqual insisted no penalties. The reason for putting an upper limit on it is simply because this represents for most students 1/5 of one of their 3 or 4 A levels. And that's to put it in context. Similarly, it will be hard to get to the standard that's shown in the mark schemes without 3,000 words minimum. So that's the kind of the target range, but there are no penalties. The focus of it can be something that extends something that you've done at AS, if you want that supporting mechanism for students. It can be part of the specification that's there, printed in the specification, and you've got so many, think of option 3, for instance, where you've got lots of titles, lots of possibilities. No matter how tangential those are to the specification you've actually taught, if it occurs somewhere in the spec, students can do topics on that. So for instance, to give you an example, if health issues are discussed as part of one of the main problems facing, say, development in Africa, there's no reason why a student can't take health issues and look at it locally. Look at health provision and access to healthcare in their local area. So you really can be as wide-ranging as you like. the student doesn't have to have personally studied it to get the idea. If you get a student, for instance, who's doing geography A level but is also heading for medicine, so they might be doing, say, chemistry and biology A levels at the same time, they could do something of real interest to them linked to health, for instance, which, as I say, you may not have taught them. They must be given the opportunity for 4 days fieldwork. Now, how you skin that one is entirely up to you, but I think I'm going to skip over this slide. I don't really know why I put in there. We could spend all afternoon here thinking about whether autumn or summer or spring is the best time to do fieldwork. You really don't need me to stand here and do this. And I'll come back to that in a sec, because I do want some discussion time. But I think if you teach the AS, which you are if you're teaching in Wales, you will have 2 days fieldwork, one on physical, one on human geography. Now, do you then go for 2 days fieldwork where students work independently? You're in a sixth form college in Stourbridge. You may just simply say to students, right, there's 2 days study time when we want you to be out studying, collecting data for your individual study. And it can be as flexible as that. You may have 4 days, not 2, in the AS year, developing a wider range of skills beyond the basic 1 day physical, 1 day human geography, and then say to students, well, you can collect your data over the summer. Again, on something that you've chosen independently. Or you might go for 2 days fieldwork as per the AS model, and then 2 days taught fieldwork, where you're getting students together to collect data in groups for their investigations on themes that in a way that you've organised. I mean, you may have, I think the reality is that you'll probably have a bit of a mix and match on this. You may have some students, I'm going to characterise, and I don't mean to, but the students who I think may need support on this are those who just lack personal confidence, and they may be bright students who do well, or they may be less able or average ability students who just struggle, but they want to get something out of this. They might take on something that you've done in the 2 AS days. Then you might actually structure your 2 AS days of fieldwork specifically with the idea of providing them, if you like, with a launch pad. At the same time, you may have 3 or 4 other students, very, very bright, very independent-minded, who are going to come up with their own study, completely independently, and that's fine as well. This particular slide and one other slide are ones I particularly want to get across. This was put together by FSC, Field Studies Council, to try and work out how you go from AS students who've just come in on their first day from GCSE to people who are independently working on their own study. And it's the slide, if you've got it in front of you, it's at the bottom of page 3 in your handout. And it's the first stage is what they call base content. And that may be a day where you organise a day's fieldwork. So those of you who've done, say, right, we've done a day in, was it Bristol, Laura? You said you've done a day in Bristol. You organised it?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, everybody went?
Everybody collected the same data pretty much.
And it was designed to meet the spec requirements. Yeah, and you wanted to collect some data that you could also presumably teach some stats techniques to, presentation techniques, etc. Everybody does it. Now, from that, students get 2 things. One, they get the content, which might enable them to think of a further idea. But secondly, it also prepares them then for that idea of fieldwork being an investigative process, so that by the time you get to the next stage, which FSC referred to as the exploratory content, you might be saying, I don't know what your next day is going to be, Laura. What's it?
We can do a co-step Budley Salston.
Budley Salston in South Devon. So you might be saying, right, here are some photographs, here are Ordnance Survey maps, you've got Google Maps because you've got 2 iPads or 3 iPads or something like that, or laptops. What's the potential for this area for investigation? What could we investigate? And you've got students in groups, as you're seated in groups at the moment. And you may form at that point those working groups. And the students then devise questions for inquiry, begin to think about the questions they might ask, if you like, the sub-questions or mini-hypotheses. They start thinking about methods they might use. They may question you about that. It might need specialist equipment. You might have ranging poles and rulers and all the rest of it, but you may not have. You know, your roundness chart, I mean, you may get something that really helps to get accurate measurements of roundness and size using calipers if you can get on the right side of your local university, or it may just be the sort of 6-stage Kaya index that's printed out on a sheet, and you make a rough guess as to whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 on the scale. But the point is that becomes a group inquiry, and so that group works together, functions together. With you consulting, they'll ask you questions and you'll develop their skills. And you may say, right, I'm going to teach the whole group, the whole class now, a particular skill in terms of how we process beach profile data, for instance. But that extends the base content because it's done by groups, and its purpose is to develop small group capacity. And by capacity, I mean capacity in terms of developing skills, capacity in terms of developing knowledge, but more importantly, capacity in terms of thinking the potential for investigation. And they get the ownership of that study. Now, the third stage, which is the individual content, can derive straight from that, in the sense that if groups seem to be functioning really well, you may then use that as the basis for individual inquiries, in the sense that you may have a group and say, look, you know, you've done one really good group of whether it's beach profile data or sand dune data, you all seem to get on really well, you all seem to really enjoy it. What about the potential for developing that as an individual investigation? So the next stage then is to come up with the titles. And again, you walk away and leave the groups to come up with a range of titles. There's 5 people on this table, they may come up with 12, 15 different titles between them. But the purpose of that is not necessarily to get a title right. I'm having that one. The purpose is to give everybody expertise in devising titles and focusing on inquiry questions and thinking of methods that might resonate with each person somewhere, so that they think, right, that's really what I'd like to do. And if you find by the end of that 3 people want to have the same title, but they've got to say, because you've briefed them, they're going to be different, they tell you they're going to be different because they'll be different in these ways, and they exemplify it, that's fine. Job done, more or less. Don't think necessarily that title generation is going to be a once and for all process, because any of you who've done dissertations yourself always remember when it comes to write-up, you know, and I was a typical male, you know, my dissertation was written, you know, late into the night and through the night on the day before hand-in, you know, typical male behaviour. But you know, sometimes when you do that, the last thing you actually write is the final title. So although there are proposal forms, and you'll find the proposal form online on the website, the title that the student first comes up with doesn't have to be actually word for word what goes with the piece of work that they eventually hand in, because they'll hand in that proposal form, and part of their evaluation might be, actually I set off with this title, in the end I found this particular investigation much more fruitful, and so I altered the title slightly. That's fine. That's given the students something to reason about and rationalise and so on. So that's one thing. Anybody want to say anything about that? This is really sort of how we then get from whole cohort, whether you've got 6 A-level students or 60 or 160, or Peter Simmons' sixth form college in Hampshire, which has got 488 AS students this year. But it's how you get from that to that. And what it means for you. I mean, it's a really good question, Charlotte, about, you know, do I want 14 wildly ranging titles, and can I cope with it? And if the answer is no, you know, to be a good tutor and coach, it's got to be stuff you can handle and you feel comfortable with and confident with. Okay, so just to summarise, students can collect data in groups. They must come up independently with their title. You can check the titles. You can talk to them about what makes a good title. You can teach them skills appropriate to the type of investigation they're doing, because you think they'll need those skills. You know, if you're going to do chi-square with them, for instance, on plant communities across a sand dune or something like that, you know, or you might teach them kite diagrams because they've never learnt those before. You can teach them as long as you don't use the data that they've collected. You know, so just The GA's got a particularly handy book called Methods of Analysing Statistical Information. And it's about 20 years old, but guess what? Chi-square doesn't change. It's a really good book to have, so you can give students books like that to work through and learn particular techniques, or you can teach them. This last one, I have to say, this is part of Ofqual's regulations. Students can work at their own pace. Every single cell in my 35-year teacher body says, no, students don't work at their own. You set them deadlines, and you're allowed to set them deadlines, so that if on September the 10th they've been collecting data over the summer, you want the data in, you can hand back and say, more data please, if you don't mind. Or if you're going to take this anywhere, you need more data. You can give that behavioural coaching as well as setting up deadlines that are in enabling them to deal with this in a kind of measured way, rather than my male work on the last minute through the night process. Any of you who find any of these lying around in a cupboard? There were loads of these at one time. They came from Field Studies Council. This is a map of Shrewsbury. Field Studies Council at Preston Montfort used to circulate things like this, saying, right, come to Shrewsbury, here are 40 titles, which are around the periphery of that. We do all of those things, your students just need to turn up and pick a title. You can't do that anymore. You can't sort of generate titles and say to students, right, here you are, the 5 of you, pick one of these each. There's 5 titles, pick one, any one. So you can't do that. The title's got to be more of an organic thing. And where I'll finish this afternoon is just in spelling out what I think the teacher role involves. Because you've got these 8 stages that I've talked about here. You've got exploring the focus. And notice how that's developing the title's the second thing, not the first thing. The focus is really important to get that clear and let the student be able to work out they've got some germ of interest in that, and developing a title and question from that. Again, flip the GCSE experience, where primary data collection is often followed up by writing up your methodology. Remember, the student's got to plan the methodology and the sampling first before they go out and collect the primary data. So they've got to go out with strategy in mind. It's not just grab a sheet, get your data, then write up the methodology. They might even have, before they start, they might even have a context statement, what we used to call aims and introduction. I actually like the title Setting the Scene better than anything else, because I think it allows you to give a kind of context of a place and the investigation you want to carry out there. They might have that written before they go anywhere and do any data. They might have that written or partly written before they do anywhere. And then they do their data collection, and from then on it's fairly routine. Stage number 5, data information presentation, then analysis, conclusion, evaluation, and reflection. Now, Nick Lapthorne, who's head of centre at Nettlecombe Court, put this together, and this is how, with the key of 8 stages there, this is how Nick sees this working out in stage by stage. So stage 1, the exploring the focus. If it were GCSE controlled assessment, that would be here. You'd have decided the title, you'd have decided the methods and everything. The students really got very little input. We're going on a field day to wherever. But actually, your purpose here is letting the students in on the secret that this is going to lead to something. And you're trying to also distance yourself slightly from this role. This axis here, the vertical axis, the teacher input, is from the teacher as instructor through to the teacher as coach, call that tutor if you like, or here facilitator, you might prefer the word supervisor, something like that. And the student role ranges on a spectrum from directed, i.e. by the teacher, to being a collaborative member, i.e. of a group, through to working fully independently. So you're already letting them in on the secret. This is almost like a kind of launch balloon that's sort of heading off, you know it's heading off up here somewhere. And the next stage is very much more independent, developing a title. But notice it's more towards this side, the student as member of a group, collaborating with a group, than it is being completely left to themselves. And again, it's not you saying, well, I'm your supervisor, but I can't help you. It's you saying, well, look, I can help you. These are the sorts of qualities that good titles have, and so on. Stage 3, methodology and sampling. Because of the safety in collecting data and planning out how data are going to be collected, group data, I think, really do have to become the norm. You will have students who want to go off and get other data. Some of the data may be individually collected, for instance, by telephone interviews, Skype, etc., email interviews. But most of the data in most studies, I think, will be collected by the group with you as coach stroke remote supervisor, you know, groups off to different areas with your phone number. Primary data, sorry, that's methodology and sampling. Primary data collection, again, you perhaps are working a bit more remotely from the group this time. You're watching from a distance, but again, notice that the group is still very much the focus for planning the methodology and the sampling strategies through to collecting the data. Then you get back, and perhaps it begins to look a little bit more like controlled assessment, in that data information presentation, students working much more independently. Again, notice the symbol here is not directly over the word independent. If I happen to be a member of your group, we're investigating something, I walk past your laptop, I see you've got a really nice way of presenting data, I can't but not see that. And anything I see like that is bound to influence me. Or I might see something as a secondary resource, say from the Environment Agency, it's got a really nice way of presenting certain data. You've handed it to me, you've lent it to me, I've taken a look at it, and I'm influenced by that. So it's not a totally independent study. In the same way as teacher as supervisor, you know, you're letting students think about the data that they present and how they're going to present it. You're not, you know, back in the staff common room having a cuppa. But when it gets to analysis, students are working much more independently, and that's when they've got to really be, you know, wean themselves away from the group. But again, no high levels of control. It's not controlled assessment. Similarly, the conclusions, whereas you might be guiding groups on how to analyse their data, you might be even coaching them with certain techniques. You know, I've used chi-square as the example. By the time they're drawing their conclusions and evaluation, and reflection, that's really up here. That's about as if you like, extreme supervision, extreme independence as the whole process gets. Now, when Nick did that, I found that really useful in terms of thinking, you know, this is kind of, if you like, the classroom phase, stroke, you know, thinking flexibly the classroom outside as well. And this is really where students have got to be working independently. But at no stage, other than really at the end, have you got a really distancing role that says, really, you just need to get on with it. At all stages, you've got a role. Now, I thought that was really helpful in spelling that out stage by stage, because I think controlled assessment, we bullied ourselves into this kind of administrative nightmare that said what you could do, what you couldn't do, and I think it became a kind of, you know, almost like the sword of Damocles hanging over us. Anybody, any comments about that? There are other things that I'll show you in a minute, just to flick through very, very quickly to get to the end of the presentation, which is much the same as what you've got there. But anybody, any comments they want to make on that before we finish? Right, just quickly, the rest of the slides on this. Sorry, this is Nick's version. Nick wanted to show with how he could play with lines. He calls it the tadpole model. That's more or less exactly the same. And he says that's the tadpole model of supervision, of getting the individual study done. It's a bit like the London circle line. If you've been to London lately, the circle line isn't a circle line anymore. It's what people call the tadpole line. It's got a sort of an arm that goes out to Hammersmith. Anyway, a bit like a tadpole there. That's straight from the spec. All specifications, all 4 awarding organisations have got that. What you can and can't do in terms of independent learning. There's something here about devising a title that you might like to look at, but that's all included in the guidance that WJEC and all the other awarding organisations are putting out about getting the NEA or getting the individual investigation done. They're all going to be very full in data. They're going to be about 60, 64 pages, that kind of length. So they'll be very detailed. And devising topics, titles, questions, methods, sampling, rules about what makes a good title, they will all be there in that booklet, which is why I'm not too concerned about having left this to this stage in the afternoon. Secondary resources, sources worth thinking about. They will vary. Some of you may, in your college or school libraries, have things like The Economist or New Scientist that are very cheap for student subscriptions. You might take Geofile or similar publications that are updates in geography. You may have textbooks like this one, Glaciers and Glaciation, that have been sitting in the stock cupboard gathering dust for maybe 2 or 3 years. You'd certainly have things like perhaps foldouts. This is a health mapping guide from Society Guardian that comes out every, I think it's Monday. Education's on Tuesday, isn't it, in the Guardian? Yeah, I think Society Guardian is Monday. All kinds of sources. You may also come across things like this that may actually stimulate studies. I don't know if you've ever seen this one. It's the map of the London Tube network. All the figures within each tube stop, the tube stops are shown in circles and the different lines shown by their traditional colours. The figures that sit inside each circle are life expectancy within the super output area within which that tube station is located. That's the highest one, Oxford Circus 96. But Canary Wharf's out here, centre of the financial district, 79. Less than half a mile away, All Saints, 89, 79 at All Saints within half a mile. Huge inequality, so there's some potential there. You could apply that as a model for Cardiff, for Swansea, for almost any city, really.